Now, just more specifically on the regulation of banks, you called up there for a 5% capital ratio unweighted for most banks. Now, that is a significant tightening, as you said, for the Deutsches of the world and some of the large US investment banks. Now, won't they say, they're going to argue back to you that if you tighten their capital ratios, they won't lend as much and you will simply exacerbate this extremely weak economic recovery? What do you say to those arguments?
These big universal banks, they do syndicated lending and stuff like this. They're not lending to small and medium-sized businesses and and households. They don't do that. It's the banks below that level that do that. So they need to be well capitalised and so on. So they can argue that all they like, but they don't do it anyway. They have a very small part of that market. They're mainly doing securities and derivatives and all this kind of stuff.
And on the structural separation argument, which I guess is the second key point of yours on bank regulation, they would probably say that if you look at history, there's plenty of examples of ordinary commercial banks folding, and maybe just as many as investment banks. And so there's no kind of empirical support for the fact that investment banking is somehow more risky, and therefore, for instance, Northern Rock, that was a fairly normal bank, wasn't it? In the UK, that struggled, whereas some of the investment banks survived. How do you respond to those arguments?
Well, actually, I don't really agree with that. I mean, Northern Rock, you see, what happened is the business model of the traditional banks changed because of what was happening in the universal banks. So the Northern Rocks and so on and so forth, they got into securitizing their loan books and either holding them on their balance sheet. Why would you do that? Because when you create a security, you can then get a CDS protection of it to make it a zero risk-weighted thing and reduce your capital charge. So Northern Rock had stacks of securitization products on it. And secondly, these banks, countrywide in America, there's so many examples of this, they were selling these things in there, and when they were competing for loans, they're driving down the lending rate and pulling in the more and more marginal, the subprime borrower, because they're competing for loans because they're selling them on, getting them off their balance sheet. But of course, to do that, the yields come down, so they're squeezing the yield, so their profitability is declining in terms of their operating profits, because they're replacing that with assets, with selling these securities. But when the music stopped, they didn't have any more securities to sell, and they're left with operating earnings which were less than what their operating costs were. And of course, the aftermath is history. So I don't agree with that.